Well, my name is Juan Fernando Alberi, and my investigation is based on a comparison between the actions taken by the United Nations during the Bosnian War between the general objective of the organization. First of all, we have the research question that is based on if the development of the actions taken by the United Nations were carried out effectively on fulfilling the Articles 1 and 2 of the United Nations Charter. Then we have the overall objective, as I mentioned before with the research question, is an analysis and a comparison between the actions taken by the United Nations during this conflict and the Articles 1 and 2 of the Charter. Then we have the specific objective. Here we have initially a layout of the context of the Bosnian War. It is important to have this specific objective to give me more information about what happened in this conflict, taking into account the consequences, the causes, the implications, and all other things that are related with the investigation. Because with the context that initially was with the Yugoslavia communism government that was carried out until the death of Tito, they start independence movements in the country, like Kosovo and other ones, that then led to the independence of Bosnia, because Bosnia was a country with a mix of cultures, in which we have the Bosniak that were that were Muslim Bosnian people, we have Serbians and Croatians. In 1990, the population of the Bosniak was 2/5 of the population. The Croatians were 1/6, and the Serbians were 1/3. That led to votes of finding if they really want the independence of the country, that was established in 1992. Then, with this vote for independence, they start a confrontation between the Serbian forces led by Radovan Karadzic, because in that date the United States recognized Bosnia as an independent country. It was a complete slaughter with these actions, because with the conflict they were killed 200,000 people, 1,070,036 people were also forced to abandon the country and becoming refugees, and also we have nowadays 7,000 people disappear. With that, it was a complete context, because especially of the independence movement that was developed on Bosnia, and with all the cultural aspects that were lead also, because with the Yugoslavia government, the many traditional Muslim institutions were banned and were abolished also, because taking as example the Kvarnik primary schools, that led to also Bosnia came to an independence. Well, with that taken into account, we have the second specific objective, that was the direct actions to make known the actions that the United Nations take during this conflict. Initially, we have the support with supplies, with some distribution points, that actually was a failure, because the Serbian movements take control of that territory, taking control of that place. Then we have the second action, that was a military introduction, like military forces to came out into Bosnia to go against the Serbian forces. However, it was a complete failure also, because the equipment that these forces was a complete mess, and they were in a capacitation to go against the Serbian forces. Taking into account that also it was the support between the Yugoslavia forces and the Serbian forces. Then we have the third specific objective, that is to explain the importance of international cooperation, because as we know, this conflict came to an end by the interventions of the United States by NATO, with airstrikes in over Serbian forces, giving them to a surrender. That was an important event with all these United States interventions that led them to Dayton agreements and to the end of the war. Then we have the justification of the investigation. For me, it was worthy to develop this investigation because it gave many ideas about all the context. Taking, for example, the first one, if we need a change of geopolitics nowadays, because as we know, it was a complete process of geopolitics and a development of new others, because we passed from Rudolf Kane, that was like the father of geopolitics, with his idea of superiority of others, in which it was based that people can go over the rights of other one only for accomplishing their own purpose. Then we have, with those ideas, that we have Karl Haushofer, that led those ideas to Germany during the World War II, of that superiority of race that came then for the invasion of Poland and all the development of the war. Then we have Alfred Mahan with his idea of naval power, that he established that a country was better off than another, taking into account if their naval power and military forces were better. That geopolitics that Alfred Mahan points was especially to the United States. And then we have Mackinder with his theory of the heartland, that established the position of Russia with a combination with Asia, with a part of Asia and Europe, making the perfect nation. However, this theory points that Russia is not in the capability to become the heartland because of its instability on politics, economics, and social aspects. Then, with the relationship of geopolitics, we have fourth order, taking into account which are the great powers nowadays, taking into account if it's the United States, Russia, China, or other countries, and how which of them participate directly in the Bosnian War. Then we have if we need a restructure of the organization, taking into account that it is not like development in a well aspect, because as it was shown with the Bosnian War, it was a complete failure with their own actions. Then we have my personal motivation, that for me, I don't share the ideas of the United Nations because it is a complete mess. Taking into account that we have the 5 countries, the great powers, that are the United States, Russia, China, France, and the United Kingdom. With that, they have some benefits in the United Nations with the veto in the Security Council that limits the decisions of it, and also doesn't lead to clear and concrete resolutions for many conflicts during the war, among the war. Well, then we have the methodology that I use for my investigation. We have the history comparative method that was introduced for it. Then we have the characteristics of the method, that initially it is a process of a social relationship, or that in my case it is a war. Then we have the orientation that is managed to some variables that we have, for me, the Articles 1 and 2 of the United Nations Charter, and the actions taken by the organization during the Bosnian War. And then we have that it is important to have a documentary research for accomplishing this method. Then, for the investigation, there were a series of steps. The first step was an analysis and a research about what happened in the Bosnian War, to give some support and to have clear ideas of what was the Bosnian War and what was the base of the conflict. Then we have the second step, that are the analysis of the actions taken by the organization, the direct analysis of it, to understand if effectiveness or if it wasn't effective. Then the third one is an analysis of geopolitics, to understand if they were if how those geopolitics affect directly in the conflict. And finally, we have a comparison between these 3 steps, to giving then a conclusion for the investigation, that is that it is based that the United Nations isn't effective at all for accomplishing the general objective they proposed at the beginning of its creation. However, it is a qualitative investigation. It is also mixed with a part of quantitative, taking into account all the data that I gave before, to give more support for the investigation and to give clear structure for it and for give more validation. Then we have the main theoretical sources that I use for it. First, we have the United Nations Charter, especially the Articles 1 and 2, to comprehend which one were them, to then relate it with the actions taken by the organization. Then we have a text called A Vision of the Future, the Geopolitics of Alfred Meehan, that was important for me because it gave me a context to understanding which were the geopolitics and how they developed along the history. As I mentioned before, passing from Keynes to Karl Haushofer, to Alfred Meehan, and then to Mackinder. And the other important text that I used for my investigation was The Failure of the United Nations in the Former Yugoslavia, wrote by Francisco Villegas. That was important also for me to give a context of all this conflict and how it develops at all. Then we have my findings and our learnings. Especially, I didn't know anything about geopolitics. That for me it was important developing all this investigation because it gave me a new learning. Because it is important to understand how it is composed our actual society and how they develop along all the history. Then we have World War One and World War Two. That I can divide it into ideas. The first idea is that how the World War Two was influenced the Bosnian War because of those Yugoslavia communists that then was disintegrated because with the World War II the ideas of communism were spread among all the world, including Yugoslavia. That's why the Yugoslavia communism was established until the death of Tito. So it is important to take in account that, because if the World War II were carried in a different way, we can think that communism in another reality come to an end with the World War II, so the Bosnian War wouldn't occur at all. And the other perspective that I have from the World War I and World War II is that it is important to understand that there are other conflicts that needs more relevance as the Bosnian War, because it is part of history and it is necessary to comprehend many points of view and to understand the situation and the history that many countries need to pass. Also, and the last one is if we have the confirmation of the United Nations, because I really was not clear with the beginning of the organization that was in 1945 at the end of the World War II. So it was important for me. Also, I understand more about the objective and the purpose of the United Nations at the beginning of its creation, how it develops along history, taking into account that it wasn't effective at all and that didn't fulfill their objective. Then, and finally, we have the conclusions of the investigation, that initially we have the ineffectiveness of the United Nations that was proved with this investigation, taking into account that with the actions taken, as the 3 points I mentioned, with the distribution points, with the military force, and with the attack of Srebrenica, it was shown that the United Nations didn't make a good labor on protecting and defending the Articles 1 and 2 of its own charter. Then we have the consequences of the independence. That is important to think about that, because independence can also become ideas of revolution and war and other things, because at its beginning the Bosnian War, it wasn't like directly to ideas or like intentions to go to a fight at all, because it all began with the independence of Bosnia and all the internal problems that come through also. And finally, we have the importance of international cooperation, that taking into account all these contexts I present with the investigation, it is important to understand that the United States accomplished a good role on defending the Articles 1 and 2 that the United Nations couldn't do. So it is important to understand it is important to comprehend the international cooperation, because with the case of this, the United States helped the end of this. Thank you.